Thanks, Brandon. I'm excited to look at how big data and AI are changing how cyclists get faster. And that's what we're all about here at TrainerRoad. Our whole purpose of existing is finding out how to make you a faster cyclist, or perhaps said, finding the best way to make you a faster cyclist. And what the product actually is it's an AI-driven training system. Cyclists sign up for TrainerRoad and they get a training plan that is developed by our system for their specific needs and abilities and whatever goal they want to reach. It creates a custom training plan, but then it adapts that plan every single day based on their performance and other variables in their life so that they get the right workout at the right time. It finds the best way to get them to their end goal, whether that's a race or whether that's something more casual, because this is for cyclists of all abilities. Whether you're a cyclist that just got into things during the pandemic and you want to take things more seriously, or whether you're a very serious cyclist and you're going for national and world championship level events, TrainerRoad serves everybody across that whole spectrum. So I mentioned earlier that we are trying to find the best way to make you faster. And that's a problem that's been, people have been trying to solve it for a really long time. And they've traditionally gone about it in a couple of different ways. First is through the traditional clinical study method. Now, this is when you take two athletes, or I should say a group of athletes, and two training methodologies, and you see which one works best. You apply that training methodology to one group, apply it to a different one. Maybe you even do a crossover study where you give them some time to reset and try again. But these studies are really difficult to get reliable data from. The reason for that is because there's so many variables that affect how you respond to some sort of training prescription. Your genetic profile, long-term training history, short-term training history, recovery, and how quickly you recover, or what your lifestyle allows you to recover from, your nutrition, hydration, all things that pertain to diet, your sleep patterns. There's endless things that affect how you will respond to training at large, then also on a day-to-day basis. So it's really tough to get individual variants controlled in studies like that. You end up with results that are just not very reliable. So the logical conclusion is to increase your sample size and to put more people in there so then you can weed out the individual variants. But then you're just trying to control all of those variables at an unrealistic scale, and it gets really tough. So it's hard to get reliable results from the clinical study side about which training methodology is best. And on the other side, there's experience-led coaching theories. So a coach has experience in prescribing something to an athlete, and if it works, that's great, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for another athlete. And furthermore, in most cases, there's a trial and error process of finding out which training methodology works for an athlete. And then once you find it, you lock onto it, but eventually you might find a point of diminishing returns, so you end up having to change it up. This means that coaching-led theories are filled with experience bias. It's really tough to avoid that. And furthermore, it's even more difficult for a coach to be able to comprehend every training prescription you could give to somebody, and at the same time, how each person with their individual profiles might react to it. So how are we approaching this problem of trying to find the best way to make you faster? We're using AI and big data. And those are two buzzwords, so I'll try to break them down a little bit more. On the big data side, we're using our data set. And our data set is composed of cycling and riding data from athletes around the world in over 150 countries. And there's over 120 million rides within our platform right now, and that's rising constantly as athletes are uploading their activities. Now, this includes an athlete's training inside using TrainerRoad, training outside using TrainerRoad, or just riding outside, or racing outside, or anything that they do on their bike. We have all of that data, and we're able to very cleanly separate it so that we know what sort of data we're dealing with. And within this, we're most interested in their power data, their heart rate data, and also we're interested in the duration data. So that's how long they did a specific effort, as well as how long the whole ride was. We have all the other data as well, but that's the stuff that really informs us the most. And what makes our data set really unique is the fact that we have this very large portion of our data set that is all about, or that has this prescription versus outcome. In other words, we know what an athlete should have been doing, and we know what they actually did. So if they matched their targets perfectly, or if they undershot or overshot, and how that unfolded, we have all of that. And that's extremely valuable. Then we also know of an athlete's current abilities, their past abilities, and we know what their goals are in terms of where they want to be. So that's another thing that makes the data set unique. And then perhaps above all, we're able to compare that athlete and see how they perform against a specific cohort or everybody in general. So that makes it so that we can get invaluable and unique insights into cyclists, and we get really powerful data that can help us understand perhaps some assumptions that have long been held about how people get faster and how they might actually not be true. So I want to go through a few of those assumptions today, not to disprove what exists, but to show that perhaps there's another way. But before we do that, we should come up with a basis for what is a fast cyclist. And cyclists typically use something called the power to weight ratio to describe what a fast cyclist is. And it also allows them to compare themselves from one cyclist to another, or themselves at one point in time to another point in time. And put simply, it's how much power your body can produce through the pedals for how much your body weighs. And that really governs your ability to carry speed, especially when you're going uphill. Power to weight ratios are extremely important. So let's look at Alpe d'Huez for some context. That's the most famous climb in the cycling world, the crown jewel of the Tour de France. And if you are, and it's about, for context, about 8.5 miles, about 3,500 feet of climbing that you make going up this climb. And if you're not a cyclist, you just hop on a bike, you might be able to produce 1 watt of power per kilogram of your body weight. And that was your power to weight ratio, 1 watt kg, as we say. But if you're a pro cyclist, you're probably all the way up to 5.5 watts per kilogram or above, somewhere between 5.5 and 6, most likely. And at that level, you would be putting out 5 watts of power per kilogram of your body weight. And if you were that beginner at 1 watt per kilogram, it would take you almost 3 hours and 40 minutes to get to the top of this climb. And if you're a pro, it would take you just under 43 minutes to get to the top of the climb. So you can see the difference between, and there's a wide spectrum of athletes in between that we serve here at TrainerRoad, and that obviously exist out in the real world. Now, the fastest time ever set up that climb is 41 minutes and 23 seconds. And that was 5.7 watts per kilogram. And that was in the 2018 Tour de France. It was Romain Bardet who set that. So with this understanding that 5.5 watts per kilogram is roughly a professional cyclist, that's pro level performance. Let's dive into some numbers and let's look at the first assumption, which is that you have to put in above 20 hours a week to get pro level fitness. Now, most cyclists or pro cyclists are known for putting 20, 30, even 40 hours a week. And that's just unrealistic for most people, particularly those that are trying to balance other life responsibilities like careers and other things. So what does the data say about athletes that are riding at 5.5 watts per kilogram, and what sort of training load are they putting in? When we look at this data on screen, we see that it's actually pretty different. A lot of athletes are achieving this at just 9 hours per week. So what this shows us is that even though one approach is to give yourself a lot of volume and you can achieve that level, you might be able to do it with less. And as a result, it might be more achievable for more athletes. So we might be able to help them get faster in less time. Perhaps it's more about what you're prescribing rather than just the overall volume of it. And a good example of this is an athlete that we recently interviewed who uses TrainerRoad. His name's Connor Wilson. And he's an analyst from Vancouver, BC. And he roughly, at different times of the year, but roughly his training volume comes out to fall right in spec with that 5.5 watts per kilogram group that we're seeing here. He was able to increase his power by 44 watts. And he was able to increase from 3.6 watts per kilogram all the way to 5.2 watts per kilogram in 18 months. And by our assessment, he'll be far over 5.5 watts per kilogram in no time. So this shows that you can achieve pro level fitness in as little as 9 hours a week, much less than that typical assumption of very high volume. The second assumption, let's look at this, is that consistency doesn't matter that much, right? Now, we all probably think that consistency does matter, but maybe we don't realize to what degree it matters, particularly with cycling training. What we're looking at here is a graph that shows the average, or perhaps the month that you deviated the furthest from your average consistency rate throughout the year. So we looked at athletes, we defined a consistency rate of how regularly they were training and carrying training volume. And then we looked at that month that fell furthest from the average. And if that month that you've had that falls further from the average, let's just call it your low month, if that falls down to within 75% of your average, you're likely to lose 2% on your power to weight ratio. But if you keep that low month within 95% of your average, you're likely to increase your power to weight ratio by up to 11%. So this is huge. What this shows us is that maybe it's not just about what sort of training you're doing, but the fact that you're just consistent with your training. And maybe we should design systems in place to help athletes just be more consistent. And a great example of this is an athlete, Jessica Brooks, that we also recently interviewed. And she's a Fortune 400 VP. She's a mother. She has an incredibly busy life, but she still manages to be very consistent. And she was able to raise her FTP by 11% in 10 months. That FTP is your threshold, basically. So she was able to improve her fitness by 11%. That's substantial. So this shows that really consistency can increase your likelihood of getting faster by up to 11%. Super exciting stuff there. Now, the third assumption is that spending time in the gray zone of mid intensity is bad and not a good way to achieve pro level fitness. Now, let me explain this really quick. There's a training methodology that exists called polarized training, and it really came about after research was done where it analyzed or just looked at the performance, observed the training habits of various pro athletes in different disciplines and different sports. And it found that they spent the majority of their time in low intensity training, about 80%, and then about 20% of their time in high intensity training. Now, low intensity is everything up until where you have to start to squeeze breaths in between or words in between those breaths on the bike. And high intensity is everything above your threshold. And that mid intensity zone for these athletes didn't have a lot of time spent in there. And as a result, it was dubbed the gray zone, and it became synonymous with unproductive training, and now has actually become synonymous with counterproductive training. So we wanted to see, is it counterproductive? And what are athletes that are achieving pro level fitness doing in terms of spending time in that mid-intensity training zone? And what we see here on screen is that it's still a substantial part of an athlete's training regimen when they're trying to get to this level. Does that mean that polarized training doesn't work? Absolutely not. It does. This just shows that there's another way to do it. And the benefit of this is that that sort of mid zone or mid intensity zone, you can get a huge amount of aerobic training benefit without all of the detriment of needing to recover for a long time from high intensity work. And you can just get those gains quicker than when you try to do it with low intensity work. So once again, when we're talking about being applicable for average folks, this is really exciting because this shows that this mid intensity work may be a key driver to achieving success and getting faster. Jarrett Oldham is an example of this. He's a cyclist that we also interviewed recently, software engineer, and his training zone distribution falls within spec and represents what we see here on this graph. And he rides at 5.5 watts per kilogram. So mid-intensity training can play an instrumental role in achieving pro-level fitness. So how are we using data and AI to address this problem of finding the best way to make cyclists faster? And how are we looking at questions like this and making changes? And the answer to that is adaptive training. It's a new feature from us, and we've just launched it a few weeks ago as of the recording of this video in November of 2021, but it's been in beta for about 9 months. And what this system does is it uses AI to analyze millions of workouts, and then it uses that data to train machine learning algorithms. We then use that data to design specific workouts and training plans for every possible scenario. And this is something we'll be doing forever. So it's an ongoing process. And the cool part is then those machine learning algorithms analyze your performance on every single ride and give your work to give you the right workout every time. So it analyzes and then understands and then recommends the next workout for you. It's super cool. And what's this been doing for people, and how has it been changing how they're training? It's making people faster by giving them the training that they need and by focusing on increasing consistency. And adaptive training has decreased failed workouts by 50% year over year. And that's looking at the same athletes that have used adaptive training, comparing previous years to this year. And when they start using adaptive training, it decreases the amount of workouts they can't complete, whether it's because too much fatigue, the workout's too hard, any number of different things. It's decreasing those failed workouts and increasing consistency. And athletes with adaptive training enabled were more than 20% likely, or were 20% more likely to raise their power to weight ratio than athletes without adaptive training enabled. So it's working. It's making people faster. And now next, we're working on a new way to be able to quantify, like a deep level analysis of quantifying unstructured rides and your races and making sure you're getting credit for all of the efforts that you're doing throughout that race. And what it means when you were able to ride at a really high intensity for a short period of time, and it was squeezed in between these really other hard times in your ride. What does all of that mean for your fitness? How can we give you credit for it? And what does that mean for the next workouts you should have? It's really exciting stuff, and it's totally unprecedented in the training space. So we'd love for you to give TrainerRoad a shot, but we'd also like to know what questions you have. Are you working on any sort of pieces where you need data to be able to find out how cyclists are training, how they're getting faster, just typical behaviors? We'd love to be able to share our data set with you, look into those questions and find answers to it. And of course, we'd love for you to give it a shot. So let us know. Drop me a message down below with the information on screen.